vision is to inspire people to find and follow Jesus.
This drives everything we do.
Without it, the church has no future.
The only reason we're here today is because
someone shared the message before us.
Now it's our turn. Today is our day.
We will gather, grow, give, and go.
Doing everything we can to reach everyone we can.
Inspiring people to find and follow Jesus.
It's why we do what we do.
All right, good morning, welcome. Come and take a seat. If you're joining us on site, it's great to be together. And if you're joining us online, why don't you say hi in the chat? It's so good to be together again. My name's Sam, and a warm welcome if it's your first time or if you've been with us many times over the years. I'm really looking forward to starting off a new series that we're going to be looking at over the next 3 weeks called Find and Follow. It's why we do what we do. So we really, whether you've been with us for a long time or whether it's your first time, whether you're just looking in, you might wonder why we do things the way we do. We just wanted to take some time to say what is the thought and the why behind the what of what we do here at New Life Church in Letchworth. And so we're going to be scratching the surface of that vision about inspiring people to find and follow Jesus over the next 3 weeks. So I'm really looking forward to starting off and where we're going to take our cue from. And there's lots of places we could go with this, but we really just felt we wanted to look at the life of Jesus. Paul describes him as the author and perfecter of our faith. And we just wanted to look at some examples of how Jesus engaged seekers and inspired followers, and use that as our inspiration to and our source of why we do what we do. Again, there's loads of different things we could do. We could look at church history, we could look at the early church, but we just wanted to go back to see how did Jesus do it, and how does that inspire us in all that we do, and hopefully give a bit of background and explanation about some of the things and the decisions and how we are as a community and as a people. So the stories we're going to look through this morning is some stories of the life of Jesus that recorded by one of his disciples, Mark. And no surprise, it's widely recognized that Mark was the author of the materials that were put together in the book called Mark. There's a bit of a giveaway in there. As that was assembled and the writings were put together, and Mark was able to journey with Jesus and record these things as they went along. And so as that was put together into what's in our New Testament now, as kind of the second half, like logical half, if you like, of our modern day Bibles, we're going to be looking at some stories that were recorded by Mark, but some of the particular ones we're going to look at today were also recorded by some of the other gospel writers as well, particularly Matthew and Luke. So you can go away afterwards maybe and find their records and their accounts of some of these things. Now it's generally understood, and from kind of the research that I was doing this week, that in fact Mark accompanied Peter. If you remember Peter, the big mouth, the bold one who would always leap in first and volunteer for everything, Mark accompanied Peter as his translator. Because Peter, being a fisherman from the area of Galilee, his sort of mother language would have been Aramaic, and most of the disciples would have spoken that language. And yet Mark was there because he was able to interpret into Greek. And not getting too technical, but the New Testament writings were all done in Greek. And I find it so interesting, again, that as we dig into more of how the early disciples and what Jesus' message and emphasis was to help make the gospel as accessible as possible. I think as I was reflecting on that, I was thinking, well, how easy would it, surely it'd been a lot easier for them just to write in the language they were most comfortable with, because that surely would have been most convenient. And yet actually they chose to record the life and stories of Jesus in Greek because it was such a much more widely accessible language. And it actually has become a language that's endured over time and has then led on to all kinds of other translations that has, again, made the gospel and the good news much more widely available. I just think as we start to unpick some of these things, it's really interesting how these choices have been made for the betterment of others, not just what was convenient and easy at the time. And maybe just a little bit of a side note that the New Testament was eventually then translated from Greek into Latin in around the 4th century, someone called St. Jerome. And Latin was obviously a very widely used language across the world at that time. But Latin wasn't really accessible to your average person. And so again, it was seen as the kind of religious language of choice, of writing, that the church and its kind of organization and hierarchy, and people who are learned and academic would have been experts in taking the Latin writings and then interpreting them and teaching your average people and the people in the churches. And so it began to become something of a measure of control, because normal people didn't have, maybe they couldn't read, but they certainly didn't have printed copies at that time. Before the printing press, again, bit of history, but copies of the scriptures had to be made out by hand. So it was very expensive, very time consuming, and so your average person wouldn't have access to that. And even if they did, they wouldn't be able to understand the Latin. And so later on, as the invention of the printing press, you get some courageous people like William Tyndale, who made a start on the first translations of the Bible into English. And this was a radical thing to do. I mean, we take it for granted now that we've got the Bible in many languages, in so many different translations. You can knock yourself out reading all these different versions. And yet at the time it was so radical. And he was very much hated for it by the authorities, because he'd taken away another stumbling stone, another blockage for people to understanding God, that they were now able to read in words that they could understand. They could form their own opinions about what it was that God had written down in his word, about what he was like, and they could start to hear God for themselves, not just being interpreted by the religious elite, if you like. And so, again, I just find it so interesting as we unpick how God set things up, that he always has wanted to make the message as accessible as possible throughout the ages. But it's taken courageous men and women to make that happen. So let's jump in. We're going to get into this story with a bit to get through. So if you do have a Bible, we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 8. If you have a smartphone, then you can also get the free Bible app. Just look it up in the app in your app store. It's a brilliant app. Again, it's got loads of translations, all free. And I'd say I like having both, the convenience of the phone app, but there's nothing also like having the sort of Dead Tree version book to be able to leaf through, and look through the pages, see the context of the writings, and also not get distracted by, phones have a wonderful way of having notifications and other things that come in, can suddenly lead you off into a different rabbit hole. So it's great to have kind of access to both. Today we're going to be looking at a translation called The Message. We use it from time to time, but feel free to kind of read along in a different translation if you've got that to hand. So we're going to start off at the beginning of Mark 8, and we're going to just kind of read through a few of these stories and pick out some what I think are really interesting points relevant to what we're looking at. So here we go. At about this same time, he again found himself with a hungry crowd. This is Jesus when he refers to he again. A hungry crowd on his hands. He called his disciples together and said, "This crowd is breaking my heart. They have stuck with me for 3 days, and now they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll faint along the way. Some of them have come a long distance." His disciples responded, "What do you expect us to do about it? Buy food out here in the desert?" He asked, "How much bread do you have?" 7 loaves, they said. And it goes on, but I won't go into then Jesus' kind of instructions, and he takes the bread, blesses it, and miraculously feeds the 4,000. And just a point on the numbers here, the 4,000 would have been probably 4,000 men, probably didn't allocate or account for women and children. So probably a lot more people than it seems like is recorded, even though obviously 4,000 is a lot. And it also probably is in contrast to another story where Jesus feeds the 5,000. In fact, we looked at that a bit last summer in our summer series. If you know the story of the boy who brings his packed lunch with the loaves and fishes, and how Jesus blesses that, and there's a miracle of how he uses that small offering to feed many. And so there's so many interesting things in here, but just a few things that I wanted to pull out. First of all, that the crowds, they came to both see and listen to Jesus. You know, how he behaved and what he said stirred up some level of curiosity in people. And that they couldn't resist it. And that's why the crowds came and followed him for 3 days, some of them coming a long distance, to see what he was doing and to hear what he had to say. It wasn't just that he had great words and is able to make great promotional or motivational speeches. They also wanted to see him in the flesh, what he was doing, see the healings and how he interacted with people. And so our actions should be of just a greater persuasion of people about the good news of Jesus as our words. You know, Jesus explained this in another, recorded in the book of John. He said this, "By this everyone will know you are my disciples, if you love one another." And so how we behave towards one another, not just our words, is so important. And we should follow the model of Jesus engaging seekers, not just by our words, but again, how we relate to one another, how we care for one another, how we love and show that for one another. You know, in this story, it's very much about practical needs. Jesus observes that people are tired, they're hungry. He's not so super spiritual that he's overlooking these kinds of things and thinking, well, maybe someone else will sort those out. I mean, clearly in this story, the disciples aren't thinking about that at all. And as I was reading it a few times, I was thinking, well, here they are. Why aren't they mentioning that this crowd is hungry and tired? I mean, maybe they're thinking, well, we're hungry and tired. But actually, as you look into it, it's quite interesting because it turns out that they had food, because Jesus says to them, "How many loaves do you have?" Well, we have 7 loaves. So obviously they came well provided for themselves. They weren't thinking about how are we going to share this or how we offer this. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that their lens was just in the moment for their own needs. And yet Jesus is thinking, he's looking around and thinking about the wider need that he can see. And we don't know how long it was between the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and this miracle. But again, how the disciples somehow, I mean, it's so refreshingly honest that somehow they seem to have forgotten that Jesus was able to perform this miracle. I mean, they say to him, what are we supposed to do about it? I mean, it sounds like he's talking to a bunch of children. Should we just go and buy? Are we able to just go and buy food out here in the desert? And his next question is, well, what do you have? And they haven't realized that actually we need to bring what we have as our offering. And it's God's the one who can then do the miracle. They seem to have forgotten that so quickly. And it reminded me of the power, just as Gail was sharing earlier, about the power of our stories, the power of our testimonies to remind us of what God has done and what he is like. I find it so encouraging and challenging as a reminder. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. I wonder if that's true, how much people would see that in our lives today. But we'll carry on. We're going to canter through this. There's loads more to unpack in these verses, but we're going to carry on to the next interaction, which is quite a different one. So he carries on now. When they arrived, the Pharisees came out and started in on him, badgering him to prove himself, pushing him up against the wall. Provoked, He said, "Why does this generation clamour for miraculous guarantees? If I have anything to say about it, you'll not get so much of a hint as a guarantee." See, this is another group who was curious about Jesus. They knew they thought they knew who he was, and yet their motivation was very different. They weren't coming along because they were curious about following him. They're in fact looking for ways to bring him down and to trap him. They start badgering him to prove himself. They want him to do some kind of miracle. Interesting. But not that they would then have faith. They're putting him to the test. They're trying to catch him out. But even in this other group of people who have some kind of curiosity, albeit for the wrong motivations, Jesus doesn't shut them out or ignore them. He still engages them. But he doesn't make it easy. He points out really that they're seeking the wrong things. That actually following God is not about seeing spectacular signs and miracles and being convinced by that. Actually, it's about a step of faith. It's about trusting and believing. And what needs to be stirred in those seeking is a rise of faith. You know, when Jesus called his first followers, he just said, "Come, follow me." There's just enough faith to answer that invitation. It wasn't his signs and wonders and spectacular things and wow, because those things fade away from the memory. I mean, that's evidenced by just the disciples seemingly forgetting a very similar miracle that Jesus had performed before. Actually, just the simple invitation to come follow me. There's enough faith to do that. Interesting, the different groups that Jesus is engaging and how he's dealing with them. And we'll carry on. The next bit of this account says, he left them, got back in the boat and headed for the other side, the lake. This is where they are. But the disciples forgot to pack a lunch. Seems to be a bit of a catering issue here. Except for a single loaf of bread, there wasn't a crumb in the boat. Jesus warned, "Be very careful. Keep a sharp eye out for the contaminating yeast of Pharisees and the followers of Herod." I mean, they've just had this encounter with this other group who are just looking for problems. They're looking to bring things down. They think they've worked out their route to God, and this guy's causing all kinds of disruption, saying things which aren't in line with what they believe or how they've shaped their whole lives. And rather than listening to the heart of it, they're seeing that as a huge threat. And so Jesus is warning his disciples, let's not worry about lunch right now. There's more important things at stake. And if you've ever done anything with making bread, you may know that yeast is probably one of the most key ingredients when it comes to bread making. And this amazing thing happens. I mean, not if you use old yeast, but if you've got fresh yeast, mix it in with flour and salt and water, and this chemical reaction happens, and it causes this sort of flat, doughy, sticky mess to suddenly rise and have body and has presence. It's amazing. But what Jesus is saying is once that yeast is in there, it's inseparable from what's made. And so if you get the wrong influences in there, you might think they're small, but they can spread throughout and have such an impact that you can't then go back and try and pick out those bits of yeast. Actually, you've got to throw the whole dough away and start again. And so Jesus is saying the small things are important. And so when we think about what we do at New Life Church, the small things do have importance. Doesn't mean we get them all right, but we're aware that the small things can have a big impact over time. And so it can go either way. It can either be a good influence or not so good influence. And Jesus, I think, is making that clear to the disciples. And it's for us to understand today that actually those small things can help us to engage people who are seeking or can be a distraction and a stumbling stone. Jesus carries on. He's having a busy day. They arrived at Bethsaida. Some people brought a sightless man and begged Jesus to give him a healing touch. Taking him by the hand, he led him out of the village. He put spit in the man's eyes, laid hands on him and asked, "Do you see anything?" The man, looked up. "I see men. They look like walking trees." So Jesus laid hands on his eyes again. The man looked hard and realized that he had recovered perfect sight, saw everything in bright 20/20 focus. Jesus sent him straight home, telling him, "Don't enter the village." I mean, again, there's so many things to look at in this encounter, but what strikes me is that Jesus deals with what is in front of him. I mean, I don't know when he got up that day, whether he had his to-do list. I mean, I'm a big kind of to-do list person, like ticking off the tasks. And I got multiple to-do lists for different things. So if one to-do list is not going very well, I can kind of switch to the other one, or the one that I feel like I'm kind of more excited about, and make progress. But I wonder, it doesn't read like he was seeking out some of these people. These were people he just came across as he was on his way with the disciples. And yet they bring out this man who's blind and beg him to give him a healing touch. See, Jesus, he might not have all this planned out, but he's intentional, he's engaged in the moment, and he's seeing the needs before him and responding to them. Someone has a need, he stops to meet it. And I think that's a reminder about, as followers of Jesus, how we're called to live. That we might have our to-do list for the day, or we might be, in the zone to get whatever we're trying to get done. But actually, sometimes we need to be aware of who comes across our path. We need to be willing to put that to one side and say, most of those tasks are really about me, about my fulfillment, my achievement, my accomplishment. Actually, when we come across people, God wants us to be mindful. He wants to be engaged in the moment, to think, well, what could I do here? What do I have to bring? What do I have to offer? How can I see this person as Jesus would? And again, there's so much in this, but there's other accounts of Jesus healing blindness, doing it quite in a different way. I mean, this seems like a bizarre story that he spits in his eyes and all this kind of weird stuff going on, and then it doesn't seem to quite work, so he has to do it again. I mean, I don't know all the answers to why, but what I can see is that the method wasn't the most important thing. He didn't have this formula that he left behind about how we're to treat this or that. Actually, the mission was clear. Someone with a need came to him, and he found a way to meet that need. It doesn't mean that we have to be so obsessed or so hung up on particular methods, I don't think. Actually, I think Jesus' emphasis is more on the mission. Let's see what's in front of us and find a way to deal with that. And so we come on to the final bit of what we're going to scooting through this morning. And this I find so challenging. So Jesus, they've finished there, and it carries on. Jesus' disciples headed out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. You can look up kind of where these places are, but they're gradually heading kind of northwards on their journey, under no small distances either. And as they walked, he asked, "Who do people say I am?" So he's asking the disciples, what's the word on the street? What are the crowds? What's the murmurings? What's the chatter about who I am? And it wasn't because he was kind of feeling a bit down that day and maybe needed a bit of a boost, or looking for some compliments. Jesus is actually setting himself up for another question that's coming in a minute. But he wants to know, who do people say I am? And so crucial that is for us to understand in our time, in our space, who do our friends, our colleagues, our family members, who do people think? What do they think about Jesus? Maybe we can ask some questions to discern that. No, because if I think about my early childhood, the world has changed. I mean, I remember at primary school, we'd go to the local church for, Easter and Christmas, and the headmaster used to play hymns in assembly. And while there wasn't loads of my friends who came to church, there was at least an awareness of God and perhaps how to find him. But the world has changed. A lot of those things aren't there anymore. Other things are held up and put forward as more important. So who do people think God is? We can't easily begin to answer people's questions or engage those who are seeking without understanding where people are starting from. So the disciples, they say, well, some people say John the Baptizer. I mean, that's got to be an odd reply, isn't it? Who is Jesus? He's John the Baptist. Well, this has got to be people who just don't have a clue, really, because they're definitely different people. So how can they be the same one? They even have a different name. So that's a reflection there that some people just have no clue at all. Nowhere in their map of life is God anywhere. And that's fine, because that's where some people are starting from. But knowing that's helpful to how we frame who Jesus is. Others say Elijah, an Old Testament prophet. Others say one of the prophets. There's all kinds of chattering and murmurings. Maybe people are getting in a sort of ballpark. And then Jesus, he set it up. He asked this question. And I think he asked this question to all of us. And you, what are you saying about me? Who am I? Or in other translations, who do you say I am? He suddenly makes it personal. Not just what's the noise, what's the word on the street, what people out there say, or on social media, or in magazines, or in books. But who do you say I am? See, at some point in our journey, in everyone's journey of seeking God, there comes a point to ask this question: who do you say I am? And what that answer is. That's the point of that invitation. No more sitting on the fence. No more just peeking in, just observing, just considering or pondering. But where are you at right now? For those of us who are followers of Jesus, maybe we can remember that moment when we felt that question really landed and we had an answer to it. And it reminds me that God has asked us to bring this question. That's the invitation that we are charged with. In our time and space now, we don't have Jesus walking around in the flesh and his trail of disciples to bring these questions. But actually God, when he went back to heaven, he left us with this mandate, with this mission. You might be familiar with this. It's called the Great Commission, captured in the book of Matthew towards the end. And it says this: Then Jesus said to them, he's talking to his disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. There's loads of messages and books out there that you can go and dig into more onto this. But it's the commission. It's what he's left us with. And it's our turn to make disciples. And what does that look like? It talks about action. It talks about going. It talks about bringing that invitation. As people are beginning to get engaged, what's that? Who do you say God is? Again, there's so many. Jesus just used questions so much to draw things out of people, to challenge them, not to tell them that they were wrong or that they were bad. Most people know deep down where they're really at. They don't need someone else to explain or point that out to them. But he just asked these questions which are so searching. Now, we might not be drawing huge crowds like Jesus. We might not be feeding thousands of people with miraculous signs. But I believe we're still engaging seekers by the way we live, by the way we come across the needs, by the way we see what practical needs people have, and we seek to address those and to bring the message through that. So when Jesus poses this question in the story in Mark, who do you say I am? Our friend Peter leaps up, and you must be thinking, well, what's he going to say now? Usually he comes out with something crazy. But in this one he says, you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. And we haven't got time to go into all of it this morning, but it's so interesting as you look at it because Jesus hadn't announced himself in that position at that point. His teachings and his miracles didn't quite amount to being the Messiah. I mean, in the Jewish culture, then the Messiah was going to be this anointed one, this king who was going to come and restore Israel, to overthrow the enemies. I mean, he hadn't talked anything like that. And so where's Peter got this from? And Jesus says, this is a revelation from God. This isn't something you've been able to figure out by yourself or you've just observed by being part of the gang. And isn't that what we need for people, is a revelation of God? And I think it's so freeing because it's God who makes that revelation to those who are seeking. But it's our job to bring them to that invitation, to bring into and create environments, to make friendships, to extend and to share our story of what God has done in us. I love this account of C.S. Lewis, the author of many famous books, including The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And he talks about and documents the final moments when he came to answer that question, who do you say I am? And he writes this. He says, you must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave him and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I just love the depiction there. Someone who was so resistant to God and yet finally gave in. When given that invitation, how gracious was God to come after him, to keep pursuing him. And those who are seeking, God is always seeking out those. We sang in the song earlier about he leaves the 99. God's always going out. His heart is for those who are out and seeking, out on their own. But it's only God who can change hearts. It's our job to offer that invitation. So how do we work this out? What does it look like? We've looked at some of the different encounters that Jesus had and how he treated different people. How does this work out for us here in New Life Church in 2025? It's quite a different place, a different world we're living in now. But it is the driver behind many things. And we have to acknowledge that people's understanding their map of where God is and who God is and their understanding, experience of God is probably very different to to previous generations. Actually, an understanding and awareness of God, of what a church is like, what it's meant to be like, about what a community of God's people is like, is perhaps something that's a very foreign concept for many people. And whereas many, perhaps not too long ago, inviting someone to a Sunday service might felt quite a comfortable thing to do, people would have some idea of what it'd be like. I think now we're in a time when actually many people have never experienced being in a church. I mean, maybe for a wedding ceremony, but so many of those happen elsewhere. Maybe at a funeral, but again, they happen elsewhere, and they're quite different scenarios to what we do on a Sunday. And so when we want to invite someone along, it can be a weird thing. Like, what happens there? People just won't necessarily know. And that's one of the reasons why after through COVID we started our live streaming, and we've carried on that because we've believed that actually that is another way to make it a lot more accessible for people who are thinking about coming, maybe have a yearning inside that they're engaging, starting to explore what it might mean to follow God, it's a very easy and safe space and way for people to look in before they come. I mean, imagine bringing children along, something you've never experienced before. I think we have to get our heads around this. And actually, we've had so many stories over the last few years of people who have joined us and said, oh yeah, I've been following along for weeks and months online because now I understand what happens. Maybe I'm more familiar with some of the songs. Maybe I know some of the faces. So when I turn up on a Sunday in person, actually it's no longer as daunting. It's no longer as scary. And we have to understand that shift is happening. It also shapes the language we use, how we speak about things. When we talk about finding and following, we want to make the language as easy as possible for people to understand what we're talking about, that we're not full of religious mumbo-jumbo and lingo that is confusing for people. Again, there's plenty of opportunities to go deeper and to study further, but on our Sunday services, we want to make them as accessible as possible. But it doesn't mean we're watering down the implications of what it means to follow Jesus. I hope that we're never doing that. Because actually, when you respond to that invite, it means change. And change can be uncomfortable because change is challenging. And you see the questions that Jesus posed to so many people. For some of them, they were the hardest questions of their life. They went away sad and distressed because they had to give up everything that they'd built in their life. It was why the Pharisees and the teachers of the law found it so difficult to come to terms with what Jesus was saying, because they would have to change and abandon a lot of the ways that they were living. So following Jesus is not an easy road. It's not a quick fix or a 10-step program to sort your life out. It's a journey. But it's a journey in the context of community, and that's what we want to invite people into. But we want to take away the barriers. We want to remove stumbling blocks. We want to make it as accessible and easy as possible for people to understand what we're talking about. So that is why it shapes our teaching themes and what we look at. You know, there's so many controversial topics we could pick out that might get clickbait or lots of headlines, but actually, did Jesus do that? I don't see that. I see him addressing difficult situations as he encountered them. But I don't see him going for what was perhaps most popular to be talked about. It just doesn't seem to me the way he lived or the way that he operated. And so he definitely brings the challenge, and I hope that we always bring that personal challenge as well. But we want to make it as easy as possible for people to engage with the message that we have to share. We invest in our environment. We want the spaces where we meet to be warm and welcoming. That's why we value welcome and hospitality. People to feel, and we've said this many times before, but we want people to feel like they can belong before they believe. Actually, you can journey with us. You don't need to have signed up or subscribed to this statement of faith or declared what day it was that you answered the question about Jesus. Actually, come and be part of us. Come and understand, just as Jesus said in that verse from John about you'll know that they are disciples the way they love one another. Come and experience that first and see God firsthand. I didn't see Jesus making these lists of requirements for people who followed him, whether it's the crowds or even when he called his disciples. He just said, come follow me. Where were they at in their lives? I mean, some were tax collectors, some were hated, others were fishermen. But he just called them to follow him and say, why should we put up barriers and make it difficult for people to come and be part and journey with us? And so there's so many aspects of what we do. It's why we believe in our fuse groups. Our small groups are great places to learn and grow and go deeper with one another. And again, they're places to belong, and we always want to prioritize that. And we're going to come on in future weeks to talk about how we are passionate about investing in the next generation as well. Jesus was always doing that. When you look at the ages of the disciples, they were young men. And yet he called them and he gave them, and he brought them close to him. He trained them up. He wanted them to see and experience what it was like to be a follower of Jesus. There's no minimum age or experience requirement in being a follower of him. And so again, that's why we put a big emphasis on our next generation, and we're going to be talking about that in a couple of weeks' time. It doesn't mean we've got it all figured out. It doesn't mean we've got it all right. But what I hope you catch is our heart and our passion is to help people to find and to follow Jesus. And that drives really all that we do. And I hope as we've looked through in very quick order some of those stories of how Jesus engaged different people, that's an inspiration for us as to what we're called to and how we should live our lives as followers of Jesus, how we can help engage those who are seeking. So as we pause in just a moment to pray, I'd like you just to consider this one thing, maybe over the next few weeks. It's very simple. Is there someone that you could invite to sit with you on a Sunday? Is there someone that you could invite to share the live stream with? Just very simple. They don't need to make any decisions. They don't need to declare where they are on their journey of faith. But just to come and belong. Just to come and start to get a taste of who we say God is. So let's consider that as something for the next few weeks. Who you could see, who you feel is seeking that you can engage. So let's pray as we draw to a close. God, I thank you that what we have written in your word is so honest. And we just need to get back to that sometimes. And see how you handled and encountered people. It's so challenging, God. I pray you would challenge us in the midst of our everyday lives to live as Jesus did, to be purposeful, but to be present in the moment, to see the needs as you saw them. That there was no entry requirements to coming to see Jesus. And Lord, help us, Lord, to remember, Lord, to bring what we have. Just as those disciples had their loaves stashed away for themselves, God, Jesus challenged them, provoked them to share that. God, what is it that we have to bring and to offer and to share? Lord, help us, God, to see those who are seeking. Lord, to think about how we can remove the stumbling blocks, how we can make the message of you as accessible as possible. And to realize that actually a lot of that is in the story we have to tell. Would we be bold and brave enough to share the story of what you have done and what you're doing in our lives? To answer that question for ourselves, who do we say you are? That can be part of our story. And God, help us as a community, as a people here in New Life Church in 2025 in Letchworth, Lord, to work out what it means to help those to find and follow Jesus. All the more that we can, to strain and strive to do all that we can to make this message accessible, to remove those stumbling blocks, to welcome people in, to help people to feel that they can belong. And trust, God, that it's you who will do the work in their hearts, just as you have done work in our hearts. God, we thank you. We thank you that you're with us, and you promised that as you commissioned your disciples, so as you commissioned us, that you'll be with us always in all we do, that we needn't fear, that God, that you said that you will be with us through this. Thank you, Lord, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, I hope you have a great week. Thanks for journeying with us. Really looking forward to covering some more bits in the next couple of weeks. If you do have children over the road, you've probably got a minute or so. Please go and fetch them. But otherwise, if you can, stick around for some refreshments, and look forward to seeing you next week.